Have you ever stopped to really think about Iran? Not just as a country making headlines for global tensions, but as a nation woven into the fabric of biblical prophecy? What if I told you that Iran, once known as Persia, is more than just a political player in today's world? It's a nation with a legacy that stretches deep into the pages of the Bible, shaping the fate of God's people and echoing through the story of human history. This isn't just about dusty kingdoms and long-gone empires. It's about a place that has stood at the crossroads of destiny, where divine purpose meets real-world drama. Take Cyrus the Great, for example, a pagan king, yet handpicked by God himself to set the Israelites free. Or Queen Esther, a young Jewish woman who risked everything to save her people from destruction in the heart of the Persian Empire. These aren't just historical footnotes. They're bold reminders that Persia, modern-day Iran, has always been part of a much bigger story, and the story doesn't end in the past. Biblical prophecy speaks of Persia's continued role in the future, of alliances, conflicts, and world-shaping events still to come. Books like Ezekiel and Daniel don't just reference Persia, they place it center stage in the final chapters of history. That means the same land that once freed the Israelites might be part of the drama that leads to the world's ultimate transformation. Imagine that, a nation whose name appears not just in history books, but in the eternal script of God's plan for the world. In this journey, we'll uncover Persia's story from its earliest biblical roots all the way to its future prophetic role. We'll meet key figures like Cyrus and Esther, ordinary people used in extraordinary ways, and we'll explore how Persia's ancient past continues to shape global events today. Let's rewind all the way back to the book of Genesis, where we first meet the descendants of Noah. Among them is Japheth, one of Noah's three sons. From his line came Magi, the ancestor of the Medes, an ancient people who eventually joined with the Persians to form the mighty Medo-Persian Empire, the foundation of what we now know as Iran. This empire didn't just conquer lands, it fulfilled prophecy. The Medes and Persians were the ones who brought down Babylon, just as Isaiah and Daniel foretold. Think about that. God's plan in motion through empires and emperors who didn't even worship him, and yet they played their part. Just like modern figures such as Gandhi or Nelson Mandela reshaped nations against all odds, the Medo-Persian Empire became a surprising instrument of divine purpose. Cyrus's decree to send the Israelites back to Jerusalem wasn't just an act of political policy. It was a direct fulfillment of sacred prophecy. Through these stories, we see a powerful truth. God's plan isn't confined to religious leaders or chosen people alone. It weaves through the lives of outsiders, kings, and empires, using even those who don't know him to bring about his will. So when we look at modern-day Iran, maybe we shouldn't just see a geopolitical puzzle. Maybe we should see a nation still carrying echoes of a divine calling. A nation that, in the Bible and beyond, reminds us that history is not random, and that prophecy isn't just about predicting the future, but understanding the past through the lens of purpose. Are you ready to see Iran through a new lens? To follow its journey from Genesis to today? Let's step into this epic story, a story of prophecy, power, and promise, and discover how the past, present, and future all meet in one extraordinary nation. What if the parts of the Bible we often skim past, like genealogies, were actually filled with meaning, hidden pieces of a divine puzzle? Take Genesis 10, for instance. There we find Magi, an early descendant of Noah, whose lineage eventually leads to the powerful Medes. His name might seem like just another line in a long family tree, but in reality, it places him and his descendants squarely in the middle of God's grand narrative: creation, fall, redemption. It's a reminder that no detail in Scripture is meaningless. Even the names we tend to skip over carry echoes of God's plan, especially when they show up later in major moments of biblical history. One of those moments came during Israel's exile in Babylon. This dark and difficult time became a turning point, and God used the Medes and their powerful alliance with the Persians to bring about redemption. It's surprising, isn't it? That divine purpose can unfold through empires and rulers who don't even worship the God of Israel. But history often works that way. Think of how unexpected alliances, like the US and Soviet Union during World War II, came together to defeat a greater evil. It's in these unlikely partnerships that we often see God's hand moving most clearly. From Magi's descendants came a game-changing moment, the rise of the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great. Cyrus wasn't just another conqueror. He was a fulfillment of prophecy, named by the prophet Isaiah over a century before his birth. Imagine that. A pagan king, mentioned by name in the Bible, chosen by God to play a key role in Israel's story. The Medes and Persians, once separate powers, united to form an empire that would alter the course of history. Their unity for a higher cause echoes modern coalitions like NATO, nations joining forces for the greater good. Under Cyrus's leadership, the Persian Empire became not just a political powerhouse, but a channel for God's promises. He issued a decree that allowed the Jewish people to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple, a pivotal moment that fulfilled Jeremiah's prophecy of a 70-year exile. This wasn't just politics, it was divine choreography. Think of Cyrus as a historical figure like Nelson Mandela or Abraham Lincoln, leaders who looked beyond their own interests and chose a path that changed history. Cyrus didn't just conquer Babylon, he transformed the world by choosing peace, restoration, and religious freedom. And here's what makes it even more powerful. Cyrus wasn't part of Israel. He didn't share their faith, and yet God used him, called him his shepherd, even anointed. Titles usually reserved for Israel's kings were given to a foreign ruler. Why? Because God's purposes aren't limited by borders or belief systems. He can use anyone, anytime, to fulfill his will. Cyrus's empire stretched from the Indus River to the Aegean Sea, yet his greatest act may have been his choice to let the Israelites go home. His decree, recorded in the book of Ezra, acknowledged the God of heaven and commanded the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. This wasn't just a political move. It was a moment of spiritual awakening for an entire nation, and it set a precedent that echoed through time. Just as the Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe after World War II, or the Civil Rights Movement reshaped America, Cyrus's decree gave a scattered people the chance to start again, to rebuild not just a city, but their faith, their community, their identity. In many ways, it was like watching the Berlin Wall fall, a symbol of oppression crumbling and hope rushing in. So when we look at Cyrus, we see more than just a powerful king. We see a man woven into the fabric of divine destiny, a reminder that God's plans often unfold through the unexpected, and that restoration can come from the most surprising places. The rebuilding of the temple wasn't just about bricks and mortar, it was about renewing a covenant, restoring a people, reigniting a faith. And it all began with a decree from a king no one expected God to use. The temple in Jerusalem was never just about bricks and stones. It wasn't merely a building project or a political move. It was a symbol, a powerful representation of identity, faith, and restoration. For a people who had spent decades in exile, stripped of their homeland and dignity, the temple stood for something far deeper, the return of hope, a chance to rebuild what had been lost, not just physically, but spiritually. At the center of this moment in history stands Cyrus the Great, a man whose leadership wasn't fueled by ego or conquest alone, but by something far greater, purpose. Cyrus challenges everything we think we know about leadership. He wasn't an Israelite. He didn't share their faith. And yet, he played one of the most pivotal roles in their story. His leadership wasn't just about power, it was about service. His story teaches us that true leadership uplifts rather than dominates, unites rather than divides. We see this echoed in the now famous Cyrus cylinder, a clay artifact that many historians consider the first declaration of human rights. It describes his policies of tolerance and freedom, revealing a ruler who saw the value of diverse cultures and beliefs. In many ways, Cyrus was ahead of his time. His vision of governance has echoes in the work of modern peacemakers like Mahatma Gandhi. Both men led with conviction, both believed in the dignity of all people, and both remind us that real greatness lies in serving others. But perhaps the most astonishing part of Cyrus's legacy is how it fits into God's grand design. Long before Cyrus was born, the prophet Isaiah wrote his name, by name in Scripture, declaring that he would be the one to set the Israelites free. That kind of prophetic precision is rare and profound. It shows us that God doesn't just work within the boundaries of religion or nationality. He can, and often does, use the most unlikely people to fulfill his purposes. Cyrus, a pagan king, became an instrument of divine promise. Through him, God reaffirmed his covenant with his people and opened the door to their renewal. Cyrus's decree to rebuild the temple wasn't just a political act. It was an act of providence, a turning point in history, a reminder that no throne, no power, and no person is outside of God's reach. And then, just when we think we've seen how far God will go to rescue his people, another unexpected hero steps onto the stage. Her name is Esther, a young Jewish girl, an orphan, living in exile. She was the least likely candidate to become queen of the Persian Empire, and yet through a series of divine twists, she finds herself wearing the crown. Esther's story is unlike any other. It weaves together beauty, power, secrecy, and courage. It reads like an ancient drama, but its message is timeless. At a time when evil was gathering strength in the form of Haman, a high-ranking official whose hatred for the Jewish people mirrored the darkest chapters of human history, Esther became the only hope for her people's survival. Haman's plan was nothing short of genocide. His actions echo those of modern tyrants like Adolf Hitler, whose unchecked power and prejudice threatened millions. Esther, advised by her cousin Mordecai, stood at a crossroads. She had a choice: stay silent and stay safe, or risk everything to speak up. Mordecai's words still ring through history. Who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? And Esther chose courage. Knowing that approaching the king uninvited could cost her life, she called for a fast, 3 days of prayer, reflection, and preparation, and then, clothed not just in royal garments but in bravery, she stepped forward. What followed was a masterclass in wisdom and courage. Esther invited the king and Haman to a series of banquets. She didn't confront him in rage or panic. She waited, moved carefully, and revealed the truth at just the right moment. In doing so, she exposed Haman's evil plan and turned the tide of history. Haman, the man who had plotted destruction, ended up executed on the very gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. A chilling but powerful reminder of a biblical principle. Evil often turns back on those who unleash it. This reversal, the enemy falling into his own trap, is echoed in modern triumphs over injustice. Think of Nelson Mandela, who turned the cruelty of apartheid into a platform for reconciliation. Think of Rosa Parks, whose quiet defiance sparked a movement. Think of Malala Yousafzai, a girl targeted by hatred who became a global voice for education and peace. Esther's story doesn't end with Haman's death, because in Persia, a king's decree couldn't be undone. But Esther and Mordecai worked together to issue a new decree. The Jews could now defend themselves. And they did. Their survival became a celebration, a day of reversal, of deliverance, of divine victory. That day is still remembered today as Purim, a festival of joy, gratitude, and the unseen hand of God at work. What's incredible is that throughout the entire book of Esther, God's name is never mentioned, not once, and yet his presence is everywhere, in every twist, every turn, every hidden miracle. It reminds us that even when we can't see him, God is moving, that he uses ordinary people, like Esther, like us, to shape history. Her story teaches us that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to act despite fear. It teaches us that no one is too insignificant to make a difference, that even an orphan girl in exile can become the queen who saves a nation. And it shows us that God's justice will always outlast human evil. History confirms it. Oppressive regimes have fallen, empires built on hatred have crumbled. But faith, courage, and truth endure. So whether through a mighty king like Cyrus or a brave young woman like Esther, one thing is clear. God writes the greatest stories with the most unlikely people. Esther's courage didn't just save a nation, it gave us a blueprint for how to use our voice. Her willingness to risk everything to advocate for her people reminds us of the power of influence and how crucial it is to speak up for justice, especially for the vulnerable and voiceless. In an age when staying silent often feels safer, Esther challenges us to rise with boldness. to believe that we too may have been placed where we are for such a time as this. Even more powerful is that Esther's story unfolds without ever directly mentioning God. Not once. And yet his fingerprints are all over it. Every twist, every turn, every reversal is a quiet testimony that God is present even when he seems hidden. Esther's life calls us to faith in God's unseen hand, one that is always working for redemption, always moving history toward hope. And as her story closes, another figure steps into view: Daniel. Daniel was no stranger to empires. He served under Babylonian kings and later under Persian rulers, living through the rise and fall of some of history's greatest powers. But Daniel wasn't just a political advisor, he was a prophet. And through a series of vivid visions, he gave us a divine timeline of history, unveiling the future long before it happened. In one of his visions, Daniel saw a massive statue made of different metals: gold, silver, bronze, iron, and clay. Each metal represented a world empire: Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. Medo-Persia, the chest and arms of silver, symbolized not just wealth and might, but its dual nature: two kingdoms united in one empire. But as the statue descended from gold to clay, the message was clear. Human kingdoms, no matter how glorious, are temporary. Only God's kingdom lasts forever. These prophecies weren't just fascinating, they were comforting. To the Jewish people in exile, they were reminders that their suffering wasn't the end of the story. God had a plan, and he was still in control. In another vision, Daniel saw four terrifying beasts rise from the sea, each one representing a dominant empire. The Medo-Persian Empire appeared as a mighty bear, raised on one side, symbolizing Persia's dominance over the Medes. It clutched three ribs in its mouth, representing its great conquests: Lydia, Babylon, and Egypt. This wasn't just poetic imagery, it matched real-world events, proving that God doesn't just predict history, he writes it. Later, in Daniel 8, the vision becomes even more detailed. A powerful ram with two horns, again symbolizing the Medes and Persians, is suddenly struck down by a charging goat with one great horn, representing Greece and its lightning-fast conquest under Alexander the Great. The goat's horn shatters, breaking into four smaller horns, mirroring the division of Alexander's empire among his generals. What's striking is how these images, written centuries before, unfolded exactly as foretold. These prophecies remind us that no empire, no leader, and no event is beyond God's control. From Babylon to Persia to Greece, every rise and fall fit perfectly within God's plan. The Medo-Persian Empire may have been destined to fall, but in the time it reigned, it played a vital role in God's redemptive story. Through Cyrus the Great, the Jews were released from exile and allowed to return home. The temple was rebuilt. Hope was restored. God's covenant was kept. It's easy to overlook the significance of this moment, but imagine being one of those exiles, displaced, discouraged, and forgotten. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, a foreign king sets you free. That's not coincidence. That's providence. It's not unlike moments in modern history when unlikely leaders step in to bring restoration. Think of Franklin D. Roosevelt leading America through the Great Depression, or the rebuilding of Europe after World War II. At first, people doubted, but in hindsight, we see how God can work through anyone, at any time, to bring healing and hope. Daniel's visions also speak to our time. In a world of political unrest, shifting powers, and uncertainty, they offer something we desperately need: perspective. Kingdoms may rise and fall, alliances may shift, but God's kingdom remains unshaken. His purposes always prevail. The fall of the Medo-Persian Empire to Greece shows us that power is never permanent. That lesson has echoed through the fall of the Roman Empire, the British Empire, and more recently, the collapse of the Soviet Union. Human strength fades, but God's story keeps moving forward. Daniel's visions challenge us to see history not as random chaos, but as a carefully woven narrative, one where every empire, every leader, every event plays a role in preparing the way for what comes next. It's a reminder that we don't live in a world ruled by chance. We live in a world guided by a sovereign God. So whether you feel like Esther, unsure of your place but called to speak up, or like Daniel, Caught in the middle of powers beyond your control, know this: you are not forgotten. God is working. He always has been. He always will be. And his kingdom, unlike all others, will never pass away. Timeless lessons for a modern world. When we think of the Christmas story, Persia isn't usually the first place that comes to mind. But the truth is, Persia's influence in the New Testament era runs deeper than we often realize, and it holds powerful lessons for our world today. Persia's legacy reaches right into the heart of the Nativity through a group of mysterious travelers known as the Magi. These wise men, most likely Persian priests or scholars, followed a star across great distances to find a newborn king. Their journey wasn't just about astronomy or curiosity. It was about revelation, purpose, and truth. The Magi were likely followers of Zoroastrianism, an ancient Persian belief system that emphasized the struggle between good and evil, light and darkness. In many ways, their spiritual framework had prepared them to recognize something sacred when they saw it. Their gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, were deeply symbolic, honoring Jesus as king, as divine, and as the one who would suffer for humanity. Isn't it amazing that the first people to recognize and worship Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew weren't Jewish, but Persian? This moment reminds us that truth isn't confined to one culture or tradition. God's messages reach far beyond borders. Just as the star guided the Magi, God continues to speak through unexpected voices and unlikely paths, even today. This idea echoes in modern life. Think of people like Albert Einstein, a secular Jew whose discoveries help believers understand the incredible design of the universe. Or Malala Yousafzai, whose courage transcends religious lines to inspire justice and peace. The point is, wisdom and truth often come from outside our familiar circles, and we do well to pay attention. The influence of Persia doesn't stop with the Magi. It shaped the very world in which early Christianity took root. Centuries earlier, Persian leaders like Cyrus the Great had already established policies of religious freedom. Unlike many empires of the time, Persia allowed people to worship in their own ways, to rebuild sacred spaces, and to live without forced conversion. This spirit of tolerance created an environment where new ideas, like the teachings of Jesus, could spread. Think of the Persian Empire like a spiritual greenhouse. It didn't create Christianity, but it provided the right conditions for it to grow. The roads the Persians built, like the famous Royal Road, connected distant cities and regions. These were the highways along which the gospel would later travel. In a sense, Persia laid the infrastructure for what the Apostle Paul and other missionaries would one day use to spread the message of Christ. Today we see the same thing happening in different forms. Just as the internet allows truth and ideas to spread rapidly across the globe, Persia's roads once did the same. God uses every tool, old and new, to reach people. Persia's spiritual influence also helped shape early Christian thought. The battle between good and evil, the imagery of light overcoming darkness, and the hope of a coming Savior, these were central in both Zoroastrianism and Christianity. The book of Revelation, for example, echoes many of these ancient themes. It's not that one borrowed from the other, but rather it shows how God plants seeds of truth across cultures, pointing them all toward a greater reality. Later on, during the Sasanian Empire, Christianity didn't just survive, it thrived in Persian lands. In places like Mesopotamia, Christian communities blossomed, even amid persecution. The Church of the East, born under Persian rule, became a powerful missionary force, spreading the gospel as far as India and China. The idea that Christianity was a Western religion wasn't true then, and it isn't true now. The legacy of Persia in the New Testament era reminds us that God's work is global, diverse, and far-reaching. The journey of the Magi is a reminder that faith can come from anywhere, and that those who seek truth will find it, even if their path looks different from ours. This matters deeply today. In a time of division, suspicion, and cultural clashes, Persia's story encourages us to listen more, judge less, and embrace the beauty of different traditions. God has always worked through variety, different nations, different languages, different people, to accomplish one unified purpose: redemption. So as we reflect on the role Persia played in shaping the world Jesus entered, we're reminded of something profound. God doesn't need uniformity to work wonders. He uses diversity to tell his story. The Magi's journey teaches us to stay curious, stay open, and stay faithful. To look for divine truth, not just in familiar places, but also in the unexpected. Because just like then, God is still guiding seekers by stars today. Ezekiel, Persia, and the end of days. Prophecy meets the modern world. The prophet Ezekiel, writing from exile in Babylon, painted vivid images of future events, some of which still leave us breathless with their intensity and mystery. Among his most talked about visions is found in Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39, a dramatic prophecy that describes a powerful coalition rising against Israel in the latter days. One of the key names listed in this coalition? Persia, known today as modern Iran. This ancient prophecy has sparked centuries of theological discussion, not just because of its imagery, but because it seems to echo through the headlines of our modern world. The prophetic vision. A rising threat. In Ezekiel's vision, a mysterious figure called Gog, from the land of Magog, leads a vast alliance of nations in an attack against Israel. Among the allies is Persia, alongside names like Cush and Put, representing regions of Africa and beyond. It's a massive multinational force united in opposition. But then something remarkable happens. Just when the odds seem overwhelming, God himself intervenes. The invading forces are thrown into chaos, struck by natural disasters, confusion, and divine judgment. The message is clear. No coalition, no matter how powerful, can stand against God's purposes. And Persia's role in this? It represents more than just a nation. It symbolizes the enduring reality that empires, ancient or modern, can find themselves on a collision course with God's plans if they're driven by pride, rebellion, or aggression. From prophecy to headlines. Why this matters today. When we hear about tensions in the Middle East, especially between Iran and Israel, Ezekiel's prophecy begins to feel less like distant poetry and more like a spiritual echo. Iran has established strong ties with other global powers, including Russia and China, forming strategic alliances that feel eerily reminiscent of the one described by Ezekiel. Iran's support for proxy groups like Hezbollah, its hostile rhetoric toward Israel, and its pursuit of nuclear capability all feed into a larger narrative that mirrors the themes of Ezekiel's vision. The idea of a looming coalition is no longer abstract. It's visible on today's geopolitical map. But Ezekiel doesn't just predict conflict. His message runs deeper. Fragile alliances and God's unshakable plan. Ezekiel reveals a timeless truth. Alliances built on rebellion or power are unstable at their core. History confirms this. Think of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a short-lived alliance between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union that ended in betrayal and war. Temporary coalitions often crumble, but God's justice endures. Even today, political deals and military partnerships shift like sand. Ezekiel challenges us to stop putting our hope in politics alone, and instead to trust in the divine hand that guides history. The rise and fall of kingdoms serve not just as a political drama, but as part of a spiritual narrative that stretches across time. A call to watchfulness and action. Ezekiel's prophecy isn't just about watching history unfold. It's a call to spiritual vigilance. We're urged to interpret global events through a lens of faith and wisdom, to stay grounded in biblical truth, even as the world changes around us. This doesn't mean living in fear. In fact, Ezekiel's message is deeply hopeful. When God steps in to defend Israel, it's not just about protection, it's about glory, justice, and redemption. Out of chaos, God brings clarity. Out of rebellion, he brings renewal. Modern voices, ancient echoes. Throughout history, there have always been people, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who stood for truth in the face of tyranny, who remind us that faith isn't passive. It calls us to action, to speak up for justice, to lead with courage in the face of darkness. Just like Nelson Mandela, whose commitment to peace in turbulent times brought unity where there was once only division, we too are called to be peacemakers, even as we acknowledge the reality of spiritual warfare. The bigger picture, God's kingdom prevails. Ezekiel ends on a note that rings through eternity. God's purposes will not be stopped. Empires rise and fall, nations form alliances and fall apart. But one kingdom endures, the kingdom of God. Persia's inclusion in Ezekiel's prophecy reminds us that even powerful storied nations can find themselves on either side of God's plans. And like Cyrus the Great or Queen Esther, history has shown that God can use even unexpected people and places to bring about his will. Ezekiel's vision invites us to ask, what role will we play? Will we be swept up in fear, or will we stand firm in faith? Will we chase temporary power or trust in eternal purpose? Will we be spectators or part of the divine story still unfolding? Transformative leaders, unlikely heroes, and a God who weaves it all together. History is full of people who stood at crossroads, leaders who made bold choices that shifted the course of nations. One such figure is Mikhail Gorbachev. He led the Soviet Union, a system built on control and fear, yet he made the unexpected choice to open it up. His policies of glasnost and perestroika, openness and restructuring, didn't just reform the USSR, they helped bring about its peaceful end. That kind of bold, redemptive leadership reminds us of Cyrus the Great, the Persian king who unexpectedly set the Jewish people free, allowing them to return home and rebuild their temple. It's incredible how stories from thousands of years ago still echo today. Nelson Mandela offers another powerful mirror. From prisoner to president, he led South Africa out of apartheid with a message of reconciliation rather than revenge. Like Cyrus, he chose restoration over retaliation. He helped mend a broken nation, not by dominating, but by uniting. Esther's courage echoed in modern voices. Then there's Queen Esther, a young Jewish woman in a Persian palace who risked her life to speak truth to power and save her people. Her courage echoes in voices like Malala Yousafzai, the girl who stood up to the Taliban to demand education for girls. After surviving a brutal attack, Malala didn't retreat. She rose. Her voice, like Esther's, changed lives across the globe. Or consider Jacinda Ardern, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand. In the wake of the tragic Christchurch shootings, she responded not with fear or division, but with compassion and strength. Her leadership was a modern reflection of Esther's, using influence to protect the vulnerable and uplift the marginalized. These women show us that courage isn't about position, it's about conviction. One voice, when guided by love and truth, can echo through generations. Modern what-ifs that make the Bible come alive. Sometimes imagining what could be helps us understand what has been. What if a modern-day Cyrus emerged, not from a place of power, but from somewhere completely unexpected? Imagine a leader rising from North Korea, not to spread fear, but to dismantle nuclear weapons and reunite a divided people. That kind of transformation feels impossible. Yet that's exactly what Cyrus did. What if an Esther appeared in our own time? A young diplomat, negotiating peace between Israel and Palestine, showing wisdom far beyond her years and shifting the course of history? The biblical stories invite us to dream of these possibilities, not just as fiction, but as hope-filled previews of what God can do through people who say yes. Ezekiel's prophecy of nations rising against Israel could inspire another vision too. What if, instead of war, the nations of the world united to battle a different enemy? Climate change, poverty, pandemics. What if we took the passion and energy often used for conflict and redirected it toward healing, toward rebuilding, toward peace? These what-ifs are not just fantasy. They are an invitation to imagine, to hope, to act. Timeless lessons for our divided world. Every one of these stories, whether ancient or modern, teaches us that courage transcends circumstance. Esther didn't wait to be ready. Malala didn't let fear silence her. Cyrus wasn't expected to care about the Jewish people, but he did. In true leadership, it's not about power, it's about purpose. Leaders like Mandela, Cyrus, and Jacinda Ardern remind us that the best leaders serve others, restore the broken, and lift up the forgotten. At the center of all of this is a powerful truth. God's sovereignty never wavers. Through the rise and fall of empires, through moments of chaos and calm, he's working, often through the most unexpected people. And that brings us back to Persia. Persia's role in God's story, and ours Persia's legacy in the Bible, is anything but ordinary. From Cyrus the Liberator to Esther the Protector, Persia played a key role in God's plan of redemption. Even today, as modern Iran stands in the spotlight of global politics, the echoes of biblical prophecy are hard to ignore. Headlines might speak of nuclear threats or shifting alliances, but Ezekiel's prophecy reminds us, none of it happens outside of God's sight. He weaves nations and leaders into his greater story, often in ways we don't expect. Sometimes he uses the faithful, other times he uses those who don't even know his name. Either way, his will prevails. So what does this mean for us? It means this. No matter where you are, you're part of the story. You might not be a president or a prophet, but like Esther, you were born for such a time as this. Like Cyrus, you might be called to act, even if you never imagined yourself in that role. Like Malala, like Mandela, like so many others, your voice, your actions, your faith matter. Persia's story reminds us that God can work through anyone. Empires rise and fall, but his plan stands firm. He invites each of us to play a role, not to chase power, but to live with purpose. So keep your eyes open. Watch for the moments where courage is needed. Listen for the call to speak, to lead, to serve. Because whether through grand acts of leadership or quiet decisions made in love and faith, you are part of his unfolding story,